Dr. Juha Uitto. Holding a Ph.D. in Social and Economic Geography, Dr. Uitto is the Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the Global Environment Facility in Washington, D.C., and he's also a visiting professor of global practice here at the Division of Global Affairs. Prior to joining the GEF, Dr. Uitto held the position of Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the United Nations Development Program. Over the past decade and a half, he has conducted and managed a large number of programmatic and thematic evaluations of international cooperation at the global, regional, and country levels, in particular related to environmental management and poverty-environment linkages. In October 2012, the European Evaluation Society awarded him for a distinguished contribution to evaluation practice. He has held visiting positions in the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Kyoto University in Japan, the International Studies Program at the University of Montana, Missoula, and has lectured widely at universities around the United States. Dr. Uitto has authored and edited several books and published more than 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on topics related to environment, natural resources management, environmental hazards, and evaluations. This evening, we will be discussing his most recent book, Evaluating Environment and International Development. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Uitto.
Thank you, Lynette. I don't know if I recognize myself in these accolades that you made, but yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity to be here. I know some of you, most not, but some of you I do know. But Rutgers has been for the past 3 years another home for me, and I have been coming here for 3 years to teach at the Global BGA, whatever it is, the Division of Global Affairs. So it's a great pleasure to be here now. So I wrote this book. I edited the book more specifically, but I wrote parts of it. And why? You know, the world talks about sustainable development. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, are coming to an end to be replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The concept of sustainable development was originally launched in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission. It was called the World Commission on Environment and Development, named then Brundtland Commission after its chair, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was then the Prime Minister of Norway. And these guys, they launched the concept of sustainable development. And sustainable development is supposed to be development that caters to development today without compromising the ability of the future generations to develop themselves afterwards. So it has this intergenerational equity as a guiding principle. Then in 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit that it was known, was held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I was actually privileged enough to be part of it. No, I wasn't part of it, but I was attending it. Well, I guess depending on how you define being part of it, but I was there. The Rio Summit, it resulted in a number of international agreements. The Rio Declaration, the Agenda 21, which was a major blueprint for sustainable development for the decades to come, and covered virtually all of the sectors you can imagine, from mountains to private sector, from coasts to civil society engagement. it came actually with a kind of a bottom line, which was something like $600 million. I mean, if we will do this, it's going to cost $600 million. I mentioned the issue of intergenerational equity that was part of the whole deal of sustainable development. But the Earth Summit and the Rio process actually introduced another partnership, which was the North-South partnership, that the southern countries in the developing world basically made the point that, hey, if you want, our actually important aspect is to develop now, to get our economies together, to make our people richer, to end suffering and poverty and all of that stuff. If you do want to make it environmentally sound also, then you gotta pay for it. And the point was that the industrialized countries, as we were, we had been basically developing at the cost of not only our own environment. I mean, Europe, where I'm from, Europe did actually cut down its own trees pretty much. And you don't see much native forests left in Europe, except that, in somewhere in Scandinavia and Finland and so forth, and in maybe some of the Black Forest region in Germany. But not only that, so you had actually developed by using the natural resources and exploiting the natural resources of the developing world. So you got to pay for it. So indeed, the Earth Summit resulted in many of these international agreements, including the Rio Declaration, the Agenda 21, and the Convention on Biodiversity, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Global Environment Facility, where I work, was also established in that connection, and it was established basically to fund what was called the incremental cost, to fund the difference between business as usual and development as usual, and what it takes to make that development into sustainable development. Now, this is 23 years ago, June 1992, so that's 23 years. It's a long time, actually, for many of you, especially who were kids at that point of time. To me, it's like yesterday. But the nations are still struggling with this issue, is what is sustainable development, and how do we measure, how do we know when we get into sustainable development? So what is this kind of a thing? What is the development? What kind of development do we need that meets the criteria of sustainable development? One of the things is that we commonly think, and the language is that we talk about sustainable development as encompassing economic, social, and environmental development. I personally would really love to include cultural and political dimensions to it, because that's what it's about, and the culture and politics are very important. But what it boils down, in any case, is that we have to aim for a society that lives within its means, that provides sustenance to all of its inhabitants, and therefore I would argue that a society where inequality has grown into these epic portions that we see now. Dig this, when you see that the people who own who own the world, the people whose combined wealth is the same amount of wealth as the wealth of the 3.5 billion of the poorest people in the world, the half of world people. We have 7 billion people on the planet. 3.5 billion then own as much as a busload of people in the north. Busload. They can fit into the Newark, New Jersey bus, the 60 or 8 people. I mean, that can't be sustainable by any measure. Where unemployment and disenfranchisement are rampant, and where poor people are scrambling to survive at the poverty line. None of that can be sustainable per se. There's another dimension, which is the human population. So in the past half century, the human population has increased twice. We're now at 7 billion people, but there's going to be 10 billion of us in the coming decades, and that's sort of like the optimistic scenario of the United Nations. 10 billion people. That's far too many to support this beautiful planet, or to be supported by this beautiful planet. I mean, but not enough with that. The fact is that almost all of this population growth is taking place in places which have the least capacity to cope with it. It's in the Middle East, it's in Africa, where the youth unemployment is the highest, where environmental degradation is making it harder and harder for people to make a living on the land. So I could talk the whole evening about this thing, but I'm not going to, because I'm basically concerned about the environment. And the environment is an important part of sustainable development, I would think, although sometimes it seems that it's forgotten from the equation. But everything that I have said about unemployment, the poverty, inequality, everything has an environmental dimension also to it. We are using natural resources in unsustainable ways. The population of the planet is increasing, and everybody is aspiring to become as rich as we are here in North America and in the West in general. And that's just not feasible, I think. The poor people are abusing the environment for their short-term survival, all at an environmental cost. Of course, the heaviest environmental toll is caused by us rich folks here in the north. With our cars, air conditioning, overconsumption, throwaway culture, and all of that stuff. But even here we are not all equal. If you think about energy consumption, which is a pretty good indicator about consumption in general. The average American consumes more than twice the energy than compared with the Japanese. And the Japanese are the second richest country in the world. Okay, China is there because they are bigger, but basically nobody can come and say that the Japanese are suffering because they are consuming less energy. And the Europeans have much lower energy consumption than we do here in the States. I'm from Finland actually, and Finland has more or less the same energy consumption levels as the United States, and it can be explained partly by the fact that it's a sparsely populated country, cold, so you have to use cars and you have to, drive a long way and keep warm and all of that stuff. Canada, by the way, has even higher per capita consumption of energy than the United States, and for these reasons. But at the same time, what about China? Everybody's now saying, "Oh, China is the problem. China, they are causing all of these environmental problems, and they don't join the fight in the climate change convention or whatever." But at the same time, that's quite natural. I mean, China became the second largest economy in the world by virtue of the fact that they have 1.3 billion people. It's like 18% of the world population are Chinese, like we were kids, so we used to count that, every fifth person is Chinese, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're Chinese. You're Chinese, actually. But the point is that the Chinese still consume less than 1/3 of the energy per capita than Americans do. Less than 1/3. If it's 6,700 kilograms of oil equivalent per person, in the United States is 2,000 kilograms in China. So don't blame the Chinese, there are just many of them, and they have the right to develop. So, hey, what are we talking about? The Chinese obviously do have some local environmental problems. They have air pollution, the degradation of land and water resources, and conversion of productive land into urban and transportation uses and all of that. And that does threaten their sustainability. We used to face similar issues in the West, and in Japan, for example, the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s were really, really tough when the government put economic development at the top of the agenda without any consideration for environment. But it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, that was silly and short-sighted, because they have since then spent a lot of money in cleaning up the environment and trying to make it better. And sometimes especially when you deal with cultural environment, it's important. It's impossible to restore what was lost in the past. So, in a way, the thing is, what I'm struggling with is that people say that once we get richer, it's easier to deal with the environmental issues, and we have to forget about the environment while we are getting rich. I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's the way it works. You gotta deal with the environment all the time, and from the beginning, and so forth. And it's too dangerous to leave it to the future. And furthermore, the Chinese environmental problems, and I'm sorry, Sulan, to harp on China in this area, but the Chinese environmental problems are largely local. There's air pollution, there's water pollution, there's land pollution, and so forth. That makes it hard for them to deal with development issues. But the contributions to the global environmental problems are actually with the rich countries. Climate change obviously is a poster boy for the tragedy of the commons, of the global commons, really. How do you, climate is for all of us, and so forth. So how do we deal with climate change when everybody is just trying to get richer, and it's terribly difficult to find solutions to agree on how do we, when everybody has to change their behavior, but nobody wants to change their behavior. This is the tragedy of the commons. But climate change still, it's, and maybe not every one of you agrees with it. I mean, I think it's something that we don't yet know very well. It's happening, and it does have human causes. But climate change is one thing that is sort of like shadowing all other environmental problems, the biodiversity loss, whatever, and there's still so much uncertainty about biodiversity. Of course, if you live in small island states, in the Maldives or in Samoa or whatever, you will vehemently disagree with me and say that this is actually affecting my life because sea levels are rising and salt water intrusion into our water supplies and storms are increasing and all of that. I guess. But the point is that the climate change impacts are hard to prove statistically as of yet. But what is not debatable is the loss of species at the rate that this has not taken place during the time of we humans have been on the planet. 1/4 of the mammals are at the verge of extinction. When we talk about biodiversity, we always focus on mammals because they are closer to us and we think that they are cute and important, but and they are. But there's so much other stuff going on. And did you know, for example, that 6 out of the world's 7 known species of sea turtles are on verge of extinction? 6 out of the 7 species. And this extinction is almost entirely caused by human activities. Deforestation is caused by conversion of lands for agriculture, forestry monoculture, I should say, for industrial sites and settlements and whatever. All of this destroys habitat. Highways doesn't only take away the land, but it also fragments ecosystems so that species can't anymore, who need a bigger ecosystem, they can't anymore survive because they have to cross the highway to be able to go to their place where they like to go to. I mean, these are serious problems. And what we consume daily has influence on it. 80% of deforestation is caused by production of 3 things. 80% is caused by 3 things. And do we use them? I guess palm oil, soybeans, and cattle. I mean, the good vegetarian folks always focus on the cattle thing, so don't eat beef because it's so destructive. But it's palm oil and soybeans that are equally destructive. 80% of deforestation is because of palm oil, soybeans, and beef. So what do we do? And the situation is obviously not much better in high seas. You know, they say that 75% of world fisheries are over fished, or at least fished at the saturation rate, which means that all the big nice fish that we like to eat, the tunas, are disappearing because they are on top of the food chain, and we end up with sardines. Nothing wrong with sardines, actually. I like sardines, but still, I also like tuna. The blink of bright light in this dark picture is that the environmental awareness is somehow raising, and it's getting relatively high. Although, interestingly, this economic crisis that we have had for the past years has sort of like had a backlash on it. And I guess, you know, it's understandable that if you have a hard time feeding your family, so you're not too concerned about the biodiversity or whatever. But still, you know, it's very important. And United States, you have seen it very, very closely how this environmental thing has become so politicized. If you're a conservative, it's like a badge of honor that you don't care about the environment. It didn't used to be like that. Actually, environment in the 1960s and the 50s was frowned upon by the labor movement, who thought that it was a bourgeois concern, that, you know, these rich people are worried about the environment. Very weird development. Very, very, very weird development. But the thing is, at the same time, it's almost another badge of honor if you're a conservative, is that you disregard science. Strange, anyway. But at the same time, environmental work is going on. Like I mentioned, the GEF, where I work, was established in connection with the Earth Summit to fund the incremental cost. And since then we have been funding something like to the point of $13.5 billion of public funding to the global environment, and we have leveraged something like $65 billion at the same time. We've been working in 165 developing countries or whatever. The Green Climate Fund was established a couple of years ago, and just last year they got their original endowment to start working, which is $11 billion. This, of course, sounds quite a lot of money, you know, and the GEF funds like $1 billion of environmental work a year. But if you compare it with all the subsidies that are going into agriculture, fuels, you name it, all these environmentally destructive subsidies, they are maybe $1 trillion a year. Public money, $1 trillion a year to basically subsidize environmentally destructive practices because of lobbies, basically, agricultural lobbies, fuel lobbies, whatever. And then they give $10 billion a year to GEF and the Green Climate Fund and the climate investment funds and whatever, you know. It's weird, actually. It doesn't make much sense. But the point here is that when the money is insufficient, we have to be effective, and we have to ensure that it's effective and efficient what we do. And that's where evaluation comes in. And evaluation this has been a very long introduction to the issue of evaluation, you know, which is the topic of this talk. But so evaluation in recent years has become a more and more powerful tool in determining not only the projects and programs that we fund and we conduct and implement are doing what they were set out to do and spending taxpayers' money in ways that the funders wanted them to be spent. But much more importantly, that we are actually making a difference on the ground. Although the word pair, monitoring and evaluation, M&E, most of you have heard about M&E, you know, you gotta do M&E, monitoring and evaluation. Rolls from the tongue very easily. But they are two very different things, because monitoring is basically a management instrument that is done to ensure that activities are on schedule, doing, you know, what they were set out to do and so forth. Evaluation is much more than that. Evaluation is not either to be confused with audit, because audit is another management function which is there to see, to ensure that funds are properly allocated and appropriated and risk is managed in organizations and so forth. Evaluation, and now I'm going to read, is defined by the UN as a judgment made of the relevance, appropriateness, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability of development efforts based on agreed criteria and benchmarks among key partners and stakeholders. It involves a rigorous, systematic, and objective process in the design, analysis, and interpretation of information to answer specific questions. It provides assessments of what works and why, highlights intended and unintended consequences, and provides strategic lessons to guide decision makers and inform stakeholders. So it's a rigorous analytical thing. So monitoring, for example, looks into, are things working as we thought that they would work? In evaluation, we are entitled to look, are we doing the right things? So not only are we doing things right, but are we doing the right things? To me also, evaluation is not value-free. Whatever policy, strategy, program, project, or intervention we evaluate it from a value perspective. Fundamentally, if we agree with the goals of the intervention, then that forms the value bottom line against which we evaluate. Yet, this is in practice not so easy to determine. One of the fundamental issues in sustainable development pertains to trade-offs. If the goal of sustainable development is to make people's lives better, while at the same time preserving the environment and the other non-human lives on the planet, the goals of preserving at least in the short term, the goals may be at odds with each other. They may not always be compatible, so we have to be very clear about these things. How do you weigh the relative value of, say, 1,000 flush toilets to human beings versus the horn and the life of a rhino, an endangered species? How do you value that? How many flush toilets should we be able to get by killing this one of the last rhinos? But flush toilets are not the issue. What about the second plasma TV in your kid's bedroom? Is that worth killing the last rhino? I'm just asking. I don't know. how far do we go to satisfy the human needs and desires at the cost of dwindling biodiversity? Environmental economists, which is another crowd that we deal with, and actually they are useful in some ways, like economists sometimes are, but not often. They have made a lot of progress in setting monetary value to a variety of things, and such as ecosystem services. They talk about it's monetizing the fact that you're gonna know how much actually value you get out of fresh water and whatever stuff. A good example is this issue of sharks. Sharks are endangered. Humans kill huge amount of sharks every year, something like 38 million sharks. It's hard to estimate. The best estimate on how you know how many sharks are killed is to go to Hong Kong and look at how many sharks fins are on the market. So a good estimate is 38 million sharks. Maybe 5 humans are killed by sharks every year, and we have this huge reaction that shark killed a human, you know, and now we have to kill all sharks. But that's not what's driving shark fisheries. It's the demand for shark fin. Now, the interesting thing what the environmental economists have come up with is that actually the ecotourism value of sharks is quickly approaching the value of the shark fin. Something like $650 or $700 million a year. So we really have to hope that the shark fishermen and the, I'm sorry, Sulan, that the Chinese who like shark fin soup, that they get the message quickly enough that there is actually more value in watching sharks than eating their fin. To me, in general, so environmental economics is important, but it's really, to me, life has intrinsic value, and not only human life. Anyway, so getting back to evaluation. So evaluation now features centrally in virtually all international organizations and programs, and it has been given an increasing independence and role in recent years to provide credible evidence of performance and results of the organizations and the programs. For example, in the GEF, where I am, and the World Bank and United Nations Development Program, UNDP, the evaluation function is independent. I report to the governing body. I don't report to the management. Nobody can censor what I am saying, and that is quite important. Our mandate is that thus not only to ensure the proper implementation of projects and programs, but the fact that they actually address the issues that they were set out to address, and that they produce results and impacts on the ground. It's also important to remember that we don't only evaluate for the purpose of the funders, the rich countries who fund activities, but we have a very important role for downward accountability to the people who are supposed to benefit from the programs and the projects that we conduct. Environmental evaluation is therefore very important, but it's an area which is somewhat behind evaluation and development work in many areas. And this is partly because environmental issues are exceptionally complex, and largely because there is a poverty environment development nexus that is hard to crack, and you know, the stuff that I've been talking about, the trade-offs and so on. So it's not so easy to agree on what is success actually, and that has many dimensions. Furthermore, environmental evaluation has a number of specific challenges. One of the things is the longer time frame. Projects and programs that we deal with are usually set for 3 or 4 or 5 or maximum 6 years. But environmental impacts take much longer to mature. So that's an evaluation challenge when you are looking at the program and the impacts, actual impacts, if you're lucky, will take place much later than the program is finished. The other issue is the geographical scale, in the sense that, you know, we know that the watershed is here, and watershed is a basic environmental unit, but at the same time, watersheds don't often adhere to the same administrative boundaries that we have set up for ourselves. And at the same time, climate change has thrown a curveball into the game, in that sense that the usual projections that are based on linearities do not apply anymore. We are dealing with risk, uncertainty, tipping points, and all of that. So, okay. Finally, I'm getting to the book. And so why did I want to do this book? It's because of all of this stuff. Because it was my hope to collect some of the cutting-edge work and research in the field of environmental evaluation in international development to benefit the practice and ultimately to enable us to use evaluation to better define what works in what context, for whom, in devising interventions to help environment that we all depend on in our lives. I got the idea of doing this book a few years ago, and it takes a long time always to do these things. But I joined the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP in 2006, from the beginning of 2006, and UNDP, the UN Development Program, as long as I remember, has had a environmental window as being one of the most important foci of the organization. So I go to the UNDP Evaluation Office and I say that, okay, I haven't actually seen any of the evaluations that they've done in the environmental field, so let me take stock of what they've done. They haven't done nothing. There was a 1987 report of a regional environmental program evaluation in Latin America. So I go to my boss, who was at that point of time Saraswati Menon, a wonderful human being, and I point out to her that we got to do something about this. And she said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. Why don't you design and do an evaluation of UNDP's environmental work?" Which I embarked upon, did, and in 2008 it was published, and it was a fairly successful evaluation. It had a lot of insights into why this lack of integration of environmental aspects was there for the UNDP. And one of the things was this nebulous poverty environment nexus, and people didn't quite, in UNDP, see how environment is central to poverty reduction. So we did a second evaluation, a follow-up evaluation, which was then published in 2010, and these evaluations, I believe, I can claim they were influential. They brought UNDP kicking and screaming partly into the realization that they have to deal with this integration issue. At that point of time, I was looking around also, and I thought that, hey, not many people have done these things. The World Bank did similar evaluations more or less at the same time, and some others. So I said to Sarah Smenon again that, look, I think we are leaders in this field. Can I make a book? Can I spend time to bring these things together and make a book out of it? And she said again, yeah, go for it. Wonderful human being, actually. I mean, there's nobody who's as encouraging as she is. And then I started collecting, I knew many of the people who were working in the field, and those I didn't know I knew of. So I started writing to these guys and girls and say that, would you like to contribute to this book? And every single one said, that's a fantastic idea, this is a really good idea. Yes, I would like to contribute. It was really, really, really encouraging and nice. And almost all of them did contribute. We had a couple of dropouts, and I regret that. But after all, these are people who are practitioners, not academics whose main job is to write papers. These are people who are out in the field actually doing stuff, contributors and so on. But it took a long time, but I was able to pull it all together at the end. And this volume that you have here somewhere, and I see Sean has it in his hand, it's divided into three main sections. The first sets out the seed. It has three issues, three essays, including my introduction, obviously, that lay out the strategic issues of environment as a global public good, and the importance to deal with the environment in the context of development. That's important. It's very, you will understand that it's really, really difficult to go and say that now environment is a priority when people can't make a living. The second section focuses on approaches and challenges of the environment as the evaluand, technical term. The object of your evaluation is the evaluand. And it contains 5 chapters, which is starting with an exploration of the principles of evaluating sustainable development interventions, and ends with the evaluation of normative work, because not all of the things that we do are implementing projects and programs on the ground. There's an important aspect of normative work, trying to set the norms and standards internationally on how we are supposed to deal with the environment. How do you evaluate that? That is the main work of the UN Environment Program, UNEP. You got to evaluate whether they are influential. And then the final part of the book is 8 case studies of, from the ground, what happened actually, and so on. One of the things is, of course, is that all interventions, whether projects, programs, whatever, are operating in a complex environment, and it's very difficult to evaluate the specific impact or effect of a particular intervention. but that's what we try to do. The authors in the book, they highlight different approaches to evaluation. What is common to it is that many of them are based on this theory-based evaluation, what we call the logic model. So how do you think that the things that you are doing are eventually contributing to the larger picture? But there's also examples of impact evaluation where you are actually trying to use different kinds of rigorous analytical evaluative models to tease out the impact of a particular intervention. The evaluators in general, we always work to improve our methodologies in order to add certainty to the findings and conclusions. We often use multiple methods and data sources to triangulate our findings to be better able to attribute any changes in behavior to a particular policy program or project, or at least to establish plausible contribution of these policies, projects and programs. This is still work in progress, but you know, the methods and approaches are actually improving all the time, and the interventions we try to deal with this complexity of issues and so on. 2015 is actually an important year for both environment and evaluation. There are and will be and have been several international events that are very important. Last month there was the third UN World Conference on Disaster Reduction, which took place in Sendai in Japan. In November there will be the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris, which is expected to come up with a follow-up, a successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol. In between, in September, the nations are supposed to agree on the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The SDGs have actually placed a lot of the draft as it is now, have placed a lot of emphasis on targets and measurable indicators. But what we evaluators have been advocating for is that measuring indicators and progress like that is not sufficient, that we actually need to evaluate to understand what is happening, what are the reasons why things are happening or are not happening, what are the causalities that foster or hamper sustainable development. Evaluation as a profession is gaining a lot of traction, which is good news, and it's actually a kind of a message to the students especially. It's becoming professionalized and it's becoming institutionalized. Last year the UN General Assembly passed a resolution on national evaluation capacity development, and the year 2015, in case you have missed it, is actually the International Year of Evaluation. I sincerely hope that you will all enjoy the book and find it useful in your professional and academic careers, and I also hope it will further your interest in evaluation as a profession. I do assure you that it is one of the growth fields in international development and beyond. There is a growing need for ensuring that we know whether the interventions that we initiate are actually having impact. As you will find in the book, evaluation is a specific field with its own specific traditions, approaches and methodologies and all of that, but it's basically social science research applied. While evaluators come from a variety of fields, many of us come from different social sciences, and my own training was in geography. It has increasingly become an academic field in itself, and there are universities in the United States and elsewhere where you can actually do graduate courses and even get a PhD in evaluation. Here at DGA, I've been here for 3 years now, and Professor Juha Uitto, who is not present with us today, is shy with it.
Apologies.
Yeah, has been a great supporter of this, and therefore we are actually trying to bring evaluation as a graduate course subject here. And that's really, really good, I think. For me personally, it's a wonderful opportunity to combine my professional work somewhere else and be able to reflect on these things academically and otherwise, and to interact with students and faculty. I mean, that's invaluable to myself. So, in conclusion, I'm truly happy to be here today, and I'm sorry that I have been talking so much. I was supposed to talk much less. Rutgers has become a second professional home for me, and I'm really happy for that Juha Uitto, who is not here, I think, invited me to join the faculty, and I'm really happy for, thankful to DGA for organizing this event, and Martin here is person who has played an important role in my affiliation here and in organizing this event, and I'm really thankful and for everything that you are doing and facilitating things. Lynette.
What can you say?
What can you say? Lynette was actually a student of the class in 2012.
15.
No.
15.
When?
I started
13.
here in 2013, yeah.
Okay, 13, okay. So it was approximately when we started. You were the second class then, and I'm so happy to have you here to facilitate all of this stuff, and really, really, really thanks to you, and I apologize for talking so long.
No, perfect.
To DGA for many years, and he's donated so much of his time, and these books that we gave you were also donated by him. He has been more than generous to us, and we can't thank you enough for everything that you've done. He teaches one of our classes in the spring. Some of you were in that class. And
only good things
thank
are
you.
said about it, yeah. So,
Global Policy Seminar. He's one.
So we have also with us today Dr. Sulan Chen, who is a contributing author to the book, and she's program advisor of international waters and chemicals for GEF Small Grants Programs at the United Nations Development Program. And so we'll give you a few minutes to introduce yourself and a little bit what your chapter was about, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lynette, and you have for your wonderful and excellent presentation. Yes, covered so extensively and comprehensively for the sustainable development, the current situation, the challenges we are facing, as well as about the book. So I'm going to be very quick, but before talking about this book and what I'm working about, I would like to really extend my thanks and appreciation to Dr. Juha Uitto. He's really, really a wonderful human being, because just like you, 14 years ago, I was a PhD student in the University of Maryland studying international relations and the political economy. He found me as his intern and research assistant, and since then we have become lifelong friends, and although I have changed the duty station from Washington DC to Bangkok, from Bangkok back to New York 14 years later, I think we're only becoming, lifelong best friends. And because we really shared, we are both practitioners we still with an academic heart. So that's why we came here about 1.5 hours early. We tried to come 1.5 hours earlier to the campus so that we can breathe the academic air here. And we went to a student bar and had very wonderful conversation with the student. And I also want to thank you, Lynette, for your invitation, and thank you, Martin, and the Division of Global Affairs. Because of my own background in government and politics, really, I feel like I'm back home again. What I've been working on. I started my career as a research assistant for an evaluation project managed by Dr. Juha Uitto in 2001, and we worked on evaluating the medium-sized projects, which is about $1 million per project. At that time, it's a portfolio about 126 projects, if I remember, 14 years ago. And then under Dr. Juha's guidance, I worked on some other evaluation, monitoring and evaluation work, and then I decided, and he also pushed me out because he said, you can't do evaluation work without getting your hands and the feet dirty. You even don't know how to manage a project. How do you evaluate others' projects? I think this is fine, and absolutely it's greatly appreciated. He's very intelligent, and he set up a meeting with a very brilliant project manager in the United Nations Environment Program. So I joined that project. It's a regional project based in Bangkok, working for the protection of marine environment in the South China Sea. I worked there for 4 years. 8 years later, I thought, okay, there's a need to change and come to New York to the headquarters of the United Nations Development Program, where I have been working with. It's called the GF Small Grants Program. Why it's called the Small Grants Program? Because the work we are doing is that we believe in, you might know this maximum, this terminology, but I put it is global, and have I jumped too much? Local action, global impacts. It's basically based on the principle of, because Dr. Juha has talked about the tragedy of commons, that, okay, when you're managing a common resource in an area, basically in the political economy course that we have been taught in your PhD classes is that there are two instruments. You use government instrument to control the resources, allocate the resources, monitor, control the resources, so that people don't steal and they don't violate the rules. Or you use the market mechanism, you divide the resource into small lands, and so that privately they own, they manage, they are hoping that they will manage it in a sustainable way. But in the program I have been working with is basically we believe in the power of the local communities of self-organizing themselves, using the social capital so that they can manage the common resources sustainably. Also in your political economy class, perhaps you also have read Eleanor Ostrom, her books on governing the global commons, and a lot of other books. I think as a political scientist, we should be very proud that she is the first political scientist that has won the Nobel Prize in economics. So basically, I'm working with this program. This program is covering 128 countries, and we give small grants of up to $50,000 per project to the local and poor communities in the areas of international waters, land degradation, climate change, biodiversity, etc. All these GEF focal areas. And if you are interested, you should read this book or check the GEF website called thegef.org. In my program, I'm managing the portfolio of international waters. I have technical thematic areas of international waters and chemicals. At the same time, I have 30 country programs under my management in Asia, Europe, and CIS countries. So on a daily basis, I sit in New York office, I run them. Okay, I do this, review the country program strategy, I write a project proposal to Washington, D.C. to get more funding, and I sometimes approve the recruitment of national coordinators to interview the grantees. But I don't know to what extent that my daily work has contributed to addressing the global environmental issues that Dr. Juha has presented to us earlier. It's really really an issue that on a daily basis we have to consider and deliberate. So under this context, 2 years ago when Dr. Juha invited me that should we write a paper on evaluating the projects or the program I've been working with, because we have funded 18,000 projects in 128 countries. How do we know that the work we are doing in each village and community, in the end we aggregate together that they are indeed reversing the environmental degradation in the world? We don't know. We go to, last month I was in the Dominican Republic visiting some of the fantastic projects and listening to the community leaders talking to us. I felt very proud. But at the same time, even though despite the fantastic job we have done, we're still facing the situation that Dr. Juha has outlined, that 6 out of 7 of species are disappearing. It's a very, very self-destructive pathway, development pathway that we have undertaken. Should we remain positive, or should we think about it and do something else? I'm not so sure about it. But anyway, in the chapter that I have written in collaboration with Dr. Juha, we outlined the challenges of evaluating a global program with such a large scale and with individual projects, and how do we aggregate that. We basically talk a lot of the, for instance, the baseline scale challenges because of these individual projects. We also talk about the capacity issue, because local people, we go to Indonesia. Indonesian women, they come up with a project proposal to us because they don't write and speak the native, the official government language. What they do, they, with the help of our program, they produce a video proposal. In the video proposal, they present to our National Steering Committee that they speak in their local language what they want to do in their community. Okay, all right. After we fund this project with a women's organization, how do we ask them later to give us data? Okay, how much carbon dioxide you have reduced in your project? How many hectares of forest that you have conserved? How many species? Maybe they even don't know before. In the end, how do we put it together? So all this kind of issue, I mean scale, baseline scale is basically a global environment situation, the total scale of the global issue we are dealing with, because we are not working at a local and regional level. I used to work in a regional project of 7 countries. It's a regional approach, and now it's a global program. The scale is tremendous. We don't know how to measure it yet. And then another issue is a lot about the local and global interest. And when we go to the communities and tell them, you have to conserve the panda, and they tell us where's our food. So there's basically a dilemma here, development dilemma here. So there are many other challenges here, and also in our daily practice work. And if you are interested, you can look into the book, and if you want to follow up with me about my work, we can have later exchanges. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we will open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Uitto.
And
Great
if
talk.
you maybe just want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Carsten, PhD student in DGA, and main interest in issues of global governance and resources, that kind of thing. So again, thank you for your talk. Thought it was you gave a great introductory overview. You raised the issue of trade-offs, relative value, and I was just hoping you to give us a little bit more of the issue of trade-back effects. How would you go about evaluating those? Maybe both, sort of at the macro level and conceptually, and also for Dr. Chen, how do you try to deal with that on the micro level?
Sorry, the trade-off, what?
Do you maybe want to say what you mean by trade-backs?
Feedback effect, so that you do one thing and it'll both have a positive effect, but it also could have a negative effect. So how do you work out the net overall effect?
I think this is a very, very important question.
Yes.
And one of the things is really that when you evaluate whatever you are doing, policy or program or strategy or project or whatever it is, we often, I mentioned earlier that we use these theory-based approaches, and the theory-based approach is that you analyze how is what you are doing supposed to be related to the ultimate outcomes and the impact. The risk there is obviously that you miss unintended consequences. And to me, evaluating are negative. Often they are negative. But we're dealing with complex systems where we are dealing with situations where you do an intervention here, but it's in a really large landscape of what's happening. There's an sorry to digress a little bit, but there's an evaluation scholar called Michael Quinn Patton, and he's talking about, you know, the complicated is the fact, like sending a rocket to the moon. It's really complicated and it's really difficult, but if all the engineers come together and they know what they're doing and they do it right, so the rocket goes to the moon. Complex is the fact where it's the situation where you can do everything right, but you don't actually know what will happen. And that is in Michael Quinn Patton's analogy. It's raising a child. You may have read all the right books and you have given him all the right nutrition and you've been really a nice and good parent, and you have absolutely no control of what happens actually. So as an evaluator, you have to keep your view open to it. You cannot just, you know, follow the intervention logic and say that, okay, so this is happening. That's monitoring basically. You have to be able to understand the broader picture. You have to be able to see what happened and what were the intended and unintended consequences. Sometimes they are positive. I think in Sulan's program there are some positive unintended consequences, but often they are negative. And it's very important to track them.
Yes, thank you so much. This is such an excellent question. We didn't have the time even to talk about it, but on the way here in the train, Juha and I were talking exactly about this topic. I can share two examples from my work. You were talking about, you know, basically measuring the negative and positive impacts and results of one particular intervention, and we try to come up with a more balanced picture and about what you have achieved. I think, you know, at the program level, I have very really an experience, for instance, in the program, is that our program, Small Grants Program, is basically a program funded by GF to support the environment protection. However, because the stakeholders we are working with is non-governmental organizations, if you look at all the international development aid, maybe 95% of the funding go to government agencies. It's a very international relations. It's very, you know, you are studying in Division of Global Affairs. It's a very government-centered development approach. But I have been very privileged to work with this program that focusing on non-state actors. However, non-state actors, non-governmental organizations in many authoritarian regimes, former communist countries, they don't have non-state actors because everything belongs to the government. However, because environmental issue is a very neutral, non-political issue, they feel less threatened. So when, for instance, 2008, I visited Laos, PDR, and to start a country program of small grants program in Laos, PDR, we speak to the Minister of the Environment. But in fact, the resident coordinator of Lao UNDP, the #1 boss in UNDP Lao, she told us, she said, we are starting a democratic governance program here. It's not an environment program because it will be the first program that we are going to set up a committee. That committee includes the majority of non-governmental organizations in face-to-face discussion with the government agencies, Minister of Environment, and they sit together and review the projects, and each vote is the same equal weight to support the non-government organization when we're selecting the projects. However, it's not in the mandate of the event, not in the terms of reference of our program, and it's neither in the terms of reference of the evaluation team when they evaluate us. So, in terms of methodology, then evaluators may have to be more open-minded and trying to see even the unintended consequences. That's, I think, Juha has mentioned about this approach. It's in this field, there's always, you have to be more open-minded and to be how can I find the word? It's like you have to really consult with the stakeholders and find out using your own methodologies to find out what is happening there. And I can also give an example about a project level case. For instance, artificial coral reef. I don't know whether you know about it. It's basically building a concrete of artificial coral reef and drop it in the ocean in the coastal areas, hoping that the coral reefs can be developed from these concretes. So the intended environmental benefits is basically to set up these artificial coral reefs. But the unintended consequences is that with this additional, this is dropping in the bottom of the ocean is already we're going to perhaps face the negative environmental impacts about it. But then when environmental scientists they are gathered together, then they have to evaluate what will be the negative and the positive impacts of this, and then they will have to decide the most optimal approach to it. So I think in the end, you always have a trade-off to an approach and have to find a balanced approach to effectively address the issue.
And the interesting thing, I think, is that you can do many issues that can satisfy actually many stakeholders. GEF is a case in point because we are a funding mechanism for global environmental benefits, basically. But for example, in Samoa, in a small island state, and I'm just following what Sulan was talking about, Dr. Sulan, is that there was a case where coastal fisheries were really getting depleted, and the communities, the local communities that were depending on the coastal fisheries were not able to actually make their living out of it, and the fish size was getting smaller and smaller, and it wasn't good. So the government of Samoa applies to the small grants program to get it's not the government actually, it's through the national coordination mechanism, they apply for a small grants program project that becomes to establish a marine protected area. Mm-hmm. And so this is what's happening. So they establish a marine protected area in front of these communities, and the communities monitor and enforce that the fact that the fishermen don't go and fish there. So these are strategically placed areas where the fish spawn and where the fish are getting larger and so on. And because fish are not known to be particularly intelligent, they don't stay there, and they swim out, and the fishermen can catch them.
They're unaware of the protected zone.
Yeah, exactly. And then they get caught. Now, so these communities then suddenly see that, oh shoot, what happened was that we established no fishing zone here, and suddenly, you know, we are getting more and more and larger fish. And these communities, honestly, were not particularly interested in the environment, the welfare of the fish or whatever. They were interested in getting larger fish catches. At the same time, then the GEF was able to actually to protect the fishery resource and the actual biodiversity in these areas. So it was a win-win situation. Of course, there are not so many win-win situations, but the point here, what I'm talking about, is the fact that you can have a situation like this, and you can see it from two different angles. You can see it from a local community's perspective of a actually income generation and food and nutrition thing, and we funded it because we couldn't care less of the local communities, but just wanted to protect the resource.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, John.
Kind of dovetailing off what the professor just said, do you think then that the gap between like the poverty and environment nexus then is not so much an actual gap as an issue of phrasing and framing? Because like you said, a lot of them, they didn't care particularly for the fact of what it was doing for the environment. What they cared at the end of the day was that they caught a larger fish. And that so many times they're framed as arguments that are counter towards each other, but then but in reality, they can serve a dual purpose of greater economic productivity and just a better overall environment. And considering, like, particularly the fact that the free market or market forces seem to be the guiding pathway for the 21st century in a lot of fields, would it seem more appropriate then for environmentalists or anyone concerned with the environment to start framing their arguments then from a more market-oriented perspective?
You know, I think that there are, I mean, it's a time scale issue in some ways, often, and definitely in the medium to long term, I don't see that there's a discrepancy between economic development, people's well-being, and environmental protection, because they are all working towards the same direction. But in the short term, there may be actually conflicts, and often it is the short term that is the important thing, when people actually are facing issues of survival and livelihood and whatever, and they are forced to exploit natural resources in unsustainable ways. So I think there's a timescale issue, and so. And the trade-offs are often there, but they are not always. It's not always very easy to find win-win situations. We did an evaluation a few years ago in GF about the role of local benefits in global environmental programs, and the conclusion was basically that, you know, you end up having trade-offs, but what you want to do is obviously to give local communities then alternative sources of livelihood and so on. So for example, so instead of them I mean, a typical thing is this thing about, you know, hunting a resource or using it as an ecotourism attraction. Then again, ecotourism has limited potential because, you know, there are just so many ecotourists, and the place has to be attractive, and there has to be enough of stuff to see and all of that. But Sulan maybe has more concrete ideas on this.
I think this is a very, it's really an issue that is more complicated than we would think about the relationship between poverty and environment, and how we can approach environment protection and address it in a more effective way. Indeed, I think norm setting and framing the issue is a very important and powerful way of doing it. For instance, if you are saying that, okay, talking about, in my personal view, it's not, I think if we don't change the concept of human well-being by the definition of economic growth, then we will not be able to solve this issue, because at the moment, the whole world is following a development path that I think is unsustainable, and they define human development almost as economic development, or, as you said, poverty, or the opposite of poverty. But then we often forgot that there's a deeper and more comprehensive concept to that. That's why I think we need a complete paradigm shift in the definition of sustainable development, or what do you call poverty. For instance, when you go to a village, even though maybe in economic terms they can only feed their families, they wear maybe a clothes for the whole week, but if they have enough to eat, and they have a house to live in, and they are keeping their family warm enough in the winter, and they have the same water, even though they don't have TV, do you think that they are living in the situation of poverty? Perhaps not. Or if you compare with, for instance, I saw this YouTube video of comparing two children of 2 years old. One is in the Mongolia grassland playing with cattle and sheep, and with very dirty hands and wearing very, worn out clothes, and the one in the small apartment in Tokyo crying in front of TV. So what is poverty? Sometimes we have to think about it. And I don't know whether you are following the concept formulation of National Happiness Index in Bhutan. Because really, if we don't change, you might have heard it, this is really, they are talking national. In Bhutan, it's a small country, inland country, it's a Buddhist country. They are now forming a country program strategy, a country strategy called National Happiness Strategy. It's not a national economic development, because Chinese in the past 30 years, and as a Chinese, I have to talk about China because China is such an important issue, a country now, is that Chinese in the past 30 years, I think we have passionately followed the development path of the United States. And in the country, in the media, among people, we always use the United States as our role model that we want to catch up with, and even overtake the United States in many ways. Anyway, it's an imagined competitor. But then if we don't change the development path, if we don't reframe the issue, I think we will be always trapped in that so-called poverty environment or all of these dilemmas, because we are not changing our mindsets. So I think you raised this issue. It's much more important than really talking one program and doing the work. But at the same time, you have so much other mechanisms and instruments with the private sectors, with the market, that is doing the complete opposite. So what is if the whole population is pursuing this self-destructive pathway, then how are we going to change it using only this kind of small projects and global program? So important. I think it's the norm setting indeed is very, very important.
Thank you so much, it is really informative. So my question about evaluation is like the relevance of evaluation to those like mega infrastructure projects, mean like water, dams, and all these things. How like evaluation of an existing project can change the behavior of, for example, a government not to build this big mega project. I think this is important because like in China as well as in India, these are like, they're going with so big projects and they also created some type of conflicts with the neighboring countries.
That's a $1 million question. How do you make evaluations count really? And it's hard in some ways, and there's always some resistance to evaluation, I think, because what do we know? We are the outsiders. We come and criticize, and there's this and that and whatever. So they tend to be often ignored. There are institutional mechanisms that have been established in organizations, like in UNDP or the GEF or the World Bank, for that matter, where every evaluation must have a management response. Every conclusion, every recommendation that we make must have a corresponding management response that then comes to the governing bodies, the UNDP board, the GEF Council, the World Bank executive directors, who then weigh both the findings of the evaluation and the management response, and then they decide what should be done, and then the decisions of the governing bodies are monitored, basically. Okay, so that's really, really important, and it's really useful. But obviously that is only pertains to what we, for example, fund. When it comes to a larger development policy issue, national development policy issue, so it's harder. I mean, an evaluation may come and say that the Three Gorges Dam will swallow communities and places and culturally significant treasures and whatever. And the Chinese government will say that, yeah, but it will also alleviate poverty and generate electricity, which is important. The evaluators, this is my evaluation philosophy, and I know that not everybody agrees with it, but my philosophy as an evaluator is that I'm not a decision maker. I bring objective evidence, scientifically based evidence, to the attention of the decision makers. And I say, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And what you have been doing, it has these results. But the actual decision making has to be with those who have the political power or the whatever power they have to develop programs, projects, policies, strategies, whatever. So I cannot go and say that you have to stop this thing because of this, but I can go and say that what you are doing is actually having major unintended consequences, for example. It's an evaluation. It's very different profession in many ways. Is how do you make your findings count? I think one of the important things is that you bring this to the attention of people, transparency. You contribute to democratic debate and democratic decision making by being transparent, and therefore it's very important that the evaluation function is an independent and transparent function. That it's not like that you just report to the guys who are doing this, but you actually are able to go and say that, look, this is what the organization, the government, the whatever, are doing, and this is what it results in. Then you make decisions, and of course, I mean, in a democratic situation, it's easier to mobilize than popular opinion or interest groups or whatever into debate, but still, you know, in any situation, it's very important to have this information available.
Dr. Chen, you want to add to that?
Yes, I have less experience in this topic, but I would like to say that decision-making is often shaped and influenced by power struggle at the domestic level. It's all about politics and interest groups, and where their powers lie, their interests are derived from, not necessarily based on evidence-based scientific findings or what is wrong, what is right. And often politicians may even know that it's not right and it's not environmentally sustainable, but because of the interest group behind them and where their power struggle in the end have resulted in a certain decision that is made, maybe is quite stupid, but they, you know, this is how they make. So still, we shouldn't lose hope that maybe one day that environmentalists will become the powerful politicians. At the moment, when you go to visit a country, for instance, even the GF, as a funding mechanism is supposed to focus on environment. Their window agency in the country, you can guess which is the one window agency, ministries in individual countries that is dealing with the GF, Global Environment Facility. Can you guess? Which country, which Ministry of Environment or Ministry of or whatever, Ministry of Natural Resources or Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education? Which ministry is the domestic ministry dealing with the Global Environment Facility and allocating the funding? It's the Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance is the most powerful. If domestic politics is shaped mostly by economists or finance people, Ministry of Environment is very, very weak in domestic politics, then environmental science and all these findings do not get into the political decision-making process, then of course they will be completely non-sustainable. Even though people like us, environmentalists, would know that dam building is in fact not only destructive to the environment, but also didn't create a significant proportion of the electricity that has been promised. It was promised that 1/3 of the electricity will come out of 340 dam. In the end, you know how much? Less than 5%. But at the same time, the entire country's national security is under threat because of the biggest potential bomb. Imagine one country, even the terrorists in the future want to drop a bomb in that, then 12 provinces under the Yangtze River, including my hometown, will be flooded. And that will be about half of the China, including Shanghai, half of China's national economic growth. I mean, any sensible scientists or environmentalists or whatever, I mean, if they are rational and scientific enough, they wouldn't be making such a mistake. Especially everybody is knowing that Egypt has a disaster project of Aswan Dam. It's very well known in the world. But why does China repeat this mistake? So often that, as a student of political science myself, you will know that in theory we learn a lot about theories and political process and political science in the book, but in the end it's really the power struggles and lots of trade-offs and negotiations, even individual interests vested in the process, that in the end the decisions are completely irrational and a mistake.
It's interesting actually, you know, that we are again entering the presidential election cycle here. Obama, in his inauguration speech, he actually referred to evidence-based decision making. He said that we will study every federal program and we will see what their achievements will be, and we will close down those ones that don't perform, and we will strengthen the ones that perform. He said it. Go back to it. Now, okay, so now we have.
You've performed an evaluation now, 8 years later.
yeah, but now you have Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and Hillary and others who are now standing up on their electoral platforms. Do you think that any one of these people is actually basing their policies on evaluative evidence of what's going to happen and what has been proven to happen, or are they basing their policies on ideological grounds? So it's kind of, there's limits to what evaluation can do, but what we are trying to do is to provide the information and the data and the evidence to anybody who wants to use it, and that's the limit where we have to work in a way, but then politics trumps evidence in many ways, but at least we try to generate some objective, scientifically based evidence on what works or doesn't. Then the politics comes into the question in the sense that the politicians have to be the ones who set the goals and who actually decide what is desired, but they have to have that information.
Okay, I have one more question to close off with, unless someone else has a question.
And it has to come from female.
Yeah, I know, right? We noticed this.
Gender
Women are
balance.
very quiet. Well, as Dr. Uitto knows, if I'm given the floor to ask a question, it's likely to just lead to another question, never end. So we'll give someone else the opportunity first. Anyone? Anyone? Well, I am a woman, so I'm just going to do it. Okay, so my question has to do with the idea of sustainable development. You say is to try to balance considerations of environment, economy, social goods. You would add political and cultural, but that's not really included. And to do it in a way that will allow future generations to live sustainable lives as well. So my question is, when you're performing an evaluation, what goes into evaluating and determining what future generations, what their needs will be in those three areas? So for instance, what is the level of consumption that you're thinking of that will be occurring in the world 10, 20, 30 years from now? Who's over-consuming, who's under-consuming, what would the ideal level be, if there is one? Or does that come into consideration? I'm just wondering how you project for the future.
Well, most of the evaluations don't get to that level because the evaluations are dealing with a discrete program, strategy, policy, or whatever. So you are limiting it to that in some ways. But what we are trying to do is to hone in on the sustainability of that initiative, and what we're trying to do is to, you have a 5-year program, and at the end of the 5-year program or whatever, so you have likelihood that you have produced, the program has produced outputs, and there may be then outcomes of something. So, for example, staying in the environmental field, so the project may deal with, let's say, point sources of pollution to a water body. So there's this big farm and there's this big plant that are leaking sewage into the water body. So the project deals with them, deals with the fact that that you have to help them to set up systems and mechanisms and technology to reduce the sewage, and you have to have a government policy that monitors and forces them to do. Okay, that's where the project ends. That in itself doesn't yet make that water body clean. Okay, the next step, the outcome, that's the output. The outcome is maybe then that less gook, scientific term, is going into the water body. When these pollution control measures are in place, less stuff goes into the water body, and that's an outcome. That's nice. You can monitor the fact. You can evaluate that less bad things are going there. But it will take years before the ecosystem actually recovers. So you have to, from an evaluation point of view, you have to try to go beyond the outputs, and you have to at least verify that the outcomes are happening. But then you can do comes back to this theory of change, the logic models. You try to move towards the future and see, what has to happen that these things are going to actually have the impact. And what are the risks when the project is finished? What are the risks that we are reverting back to something bad? So you try to project it to sort of like the impact of the potential impact of what you did and sustainability, the potential sustainability of what you did. I don't know if that, but at the same time you cannot really take a stance on how rich people should get or whatever.
Okay.
I mean, it's now these people are getting too rich, stop.
No, or even,
stop
I
that.
suppose even in terms of use of natural resources, for instance,
Yeah.
what is sustainable? How do we know what the stress point, the absolute stress point that it...
Yeah, we don't. That is one of the difficulties in environmental evaluation, is that the linearity of the systems is not clear. You have tipping points, you have points when things don't anymore act in a linear way. So therefore, what you try to do is basically think of, here this is where the whole issue of precautionary principle comes. And it's an interesting debate, obviously, because in climate change, for example, many people say that, hey, we have to be really careful because we don't know what's going to happen. And others are saying that, oh, it's all hypothetical. And we don't know if it's going to be if it's going to be a problem, even if the climate is. I mean, I'm not even talking about people who deny climate change, but many people actually are saying then, hey, we don't know what's going to happen, so why waste all of this money in getting prepared for something that is, we don't know what's going to happen. Political decision-making processes where evaluation can bring information and data to the table.
Good.
Makes sense?
Absolutely.
Well, I think it's also a very difficult question, because I think for sure we know the ecosystem as a whole is degrading, and but when you try to attribute the degradation of ecosystem to individual responsibilities and assign a value how much we should consume and how we should live our life, it's very, very difficult. Hence, I also feel like in managing an ecosystem, we should look at the local context and local situation. Environment is global, but at the same time, managing the environmental issue perhaps should starting with a manageable scale, so that you can identify to what extent you can, if you, for instance, when I was working with the South China Sea project, I went to Sulan Chen in the Vietnam, is a national park, so that we basically measure how many fishermen are fishing in this area, and then we measure their catching every year, and then we look at their trends and decide that we should introduce a regime that, okay, from what season that this should stop, so that later on we can increase the catch. So if you really can, you can reduce your scale of management and intervention, perhaps you can do that. Attribute the degradation to individual consumption and the use, extraction of the resources. But if you ask at the global level, I think it's very, very difficult.
And this is in the chapter in the book that you wrote. Basically, the scale issue is the most important thing. So you can be doing many very useful things at the local level, but how do you aggregate it? Mm-hmm. How do you aggregate the results, and how do you prove that these, whatever, 17,000 small projects that you have,
in the end, yeah,
that they add up to something globally significant?
Yes, and I also want to use this opportunity to just brief you quickly about our new approach, realizing because the scale challenge we have identified in our book, because we are managing a global program, and for instance, we gave $2 million to China for 4 years, asking them to protect the environment in China. Later on, it's impossible to measure because China is as big as perhaps Europe almost, right? So what do we do that? How do we do that? So in our new strategy is that we're taking a landscape and seascape approach, that in that we ask the country programs